So-called coincidences are links in the chain of inevitability. Xiefeng. Was it a mere coincidence that the Titanic struck an iceberg? Let's examine three precursors related to the Titanic's collision with the iceberg. In 1898, British writer Morgan Robertson published a novel titled Futility. The story describes a luxurious ocean liner named the Titan, which is said to be unsinkable, on its maiden voyage from Britain to America. This is the largest and most opulent passenger ship in the history of human navigation, equipped with all the luxurious facilities available at the time. The ship is filled with wealthy passengers who are enjoying themselves to the fullest. However, the ship strikes an iceberg and tragically sinks, with many passengers perishing at issue. No one could have anticipated that the events described in this novel would become a tragic reality 14 years later. On the night of April 14, 1912, the largest luxury liner at the time, the Titanic, struck an iceberg and sank. After the tragedy, people remembered the novel and discovered that, apart from the ship names being almost identical, there were numerous striking similarities. Both sank on their maiden voyages after hitting an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Both ships sailed in April from Britain to America. The fictional Titan had a passenger and crew count of 3,000, while the Titanic's count was nearly the same. The Titan was described as weighing 70,000 tons, while the Titanic actually weighed 66,000 tons. The Titan was 800 feet long, and the Titanic was slightly longer. Both had three propellers and collided with an iceberg at a speed of 23 knots. Another similarity was that the heavy casualties in both disasters were due to the insufficient number of lifeboats on board. Comparisons of the New York Times report on the Titanic's sinking revealed that the details and processes were eerily similar to those in Robertson's novel. It could be said that the novel's story was a prelude to the Titanic's sinking 14 years later. It is said that Morgan Robertson, the author of the novel, committed suicide with a gun in Atlantic City, New Jersey, shortly after the Titanic sank, and no one knows the reason for his suicide. British businessman John Warner urgently needed to travel to America on business, and on March 23, 1912, he purchased a highly sought-after ticket for the Titanic. However, in the 10 days leading up to the departure, he dreamt twice of the ship sinking, throwing many adults and children into the water. Troubled by these dreams, he decided to return his ticket. Another person, Charles Morgan, a pastor from Winnipeg, Canada, dreamed of a massive ship striking an iceberg on a dark sea with people screaming and crying on the deck. Between 1900 and 1923, a stone sarcophagus was discovered in an ancient Egyptian tomb, predating the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. The sarcophagus bore an inscription: "Anyone who encounters this sarcophagus will suffer misfortune or be swallowed by the sea." Indeed, almost all who were involved with the sarcophagus met untimely and mysterious deaths. The sarcophagus was eventually purchased by an American millionaire, and in March 1912, it was loaded onto the Titanic, destined for an exhibition in America. Unexpectedly, the Titanic struck an iceberg during its voyage, and the sarcophagus, along with the ship, was swallowed by the sea. Inside the sarcophagus lay Princess Eminare. How did this cursed artifact end up on the Titanic? Quotation: in the late 1890s, four young British men traveled to Egypt, where a local smuggler sold them a mummy and sarcophagus. Inside the sarcophagus was Princess Eminare. The four British men decided to purchase the mummy for a hefty sum of several thousand pounds. From that moment on, this obscure princess in ancient Egyptian history brought about a series of bizarre and terrifying misfortunes. The British man who bought the mummy took it back to his hotel. A few hours later, for reasons unknown, he left the hotel, walked into the nearby desert, and disappeared without a trace, never to return. The next day, one of his companions was shot and seriously injured on the streets of Egypt, ultimately losing his arm. The remaining two men also faced misfortune. One went bankrupt for no apparent reason upon returning home, and the other fell seriously ill and ended up on the street. The mysterious mummy was eventually shipped to England, but strange incidents continued to occur along the way. The mummy was finally purchased by a British millionaire who was passionate about ancient Egyptian culture. However, the misfortunes persisted. Not long after, three of the millionaire's family members were severely injured in a bizarre car accident, and his mansion was ravaged by fire. Faced with such calamities, the millionaire had no choice but to donate the mummy to the British Museum. Princess Eminere's curse showed signs even before the mummy reached the museum. While transporting the mummy, the cargo truck inexplicably lost control in the parking lot, reversing and injuring a bystander. Then, two workers carrying the princess's sarcophagus into the museum dropped it on the stairs, injuring one worker's foot, while the other worker died suddenly 2 days later for no apparent reason. But the real trouble was only beginning. Amenare's sarcophagus was displayed in the British Museum's Egyptian exhibit. During its display, night guards reported hearing knocking and crying sounds near the sarcophagus, and even other artifacts in the exhibit made strange noises. Incidents occurred one after another, often accompanied by fatalities. One guard died while on duty, scaring the others into considering collective resignation. Due to the escalating incidents, the British Museum decided to move the sarcophagus to the basement, believing that hiding it away would halt the curse. Did this measure work? It proved futile, as within a week, another person lost their life. The museum curator who had decided to move the mummy to the basement, dying in his office. By this point, the cursed mummy had gained notoriety, attracting the attention of the British media. A photographer ventured into the basement to take photos of Amenare's mummy, only to develop an image showing a terrifying face. The next day, the photographer was found dead in his home, the cause being suicide by gunshot. Soon after, the British Museum sold the ill-fated mummy to a private collector, who sought the services of Europe's most renowned witch, Madame Blavatsky, for an exorcism. After a lengthy ritual, Madame Blavatsky declared that the mummy still possessed an astonishing amount of evil energy and that the curse could never be lifted. Finally, the witch advised disposing of the mummy as soon as possible. However, by this point, no museum was willing to accept Amenare's mummy, as nearly 20 people had suffered misfortunes or even lost their lives over the past decade due to the mummy. The story doesn't end here. Not long after, an American archaeologist, undeterred by Amenare's dreadful history, purchased the mummy at a significant cost, planning to place it in New York City. Personally overseeing its transport, he had the mummy placed on a massive liner that was making waves in the shipbuilding industry at the time. To be extra cautious, the mummy was placed near the captain's quarters, hoping for a safe journey to New York. That ship was the Titanic. Just as the sarcophagus had warned, anyone who encounters this sarcophagus will suffer misfortune or be swallowed by the sea. Do we still think it was merely a coincidence that the Titanic struck an iceberg?